Welcome, welcome, welcome. And thank you for joining us for the first annual Decarbonization Hydrogen Forum. Hydrogen, the time is now. Creating a hydrogen economy to achieve net zero, co-hosted by the University of Central Florida and Mitsubishi Power. My name is Brandon and I'll be your host today. We have an exciting program ahead of us, including a keynote by Jennifer Wilcox from the Department of Energy, a fireside chat with UCF's President Dr. Cartwright and Mitsubishi Power America's President Bill Newsom. We'll also hear from industry leaders on two panels. One will focus on developing hydrogen infrastructure, and the other on policies to support the energy transition. This is a hybrid event, and we would like to invite participation from both audiences. For those of you online, please use the chat function to submit questions. We also ask that you please state your name and affiliation before posing a question to the speakers or the panelists. I'd like to ask to the podium Dr. Grace Bohannon, Director of the School for Modeling and Simulation, to introduce the keynote speaker. Dr. Bohannon.
Thank you. Wow, it is so nice to be here this morning. And, you know, as a prior director of one of the Department of Energy's national labs, the National Energy Technology Lab, I have such a deep respect for the research that is being done in the Department of Energy that continues to propel our country forward. And it is from that lens that I am just excited and want to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Wilcox, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy and Carbon Management from the Department of Energy. And she was appointed to that position in January of 2020. In this capacity, she has responsibility over minimizing the environmental impacts of fossil fuels while working towards net zero emissions, advancing carbon management approaches toward deep decarbonization, technologies that lead to sustainable energy resources, and it is an important and vast mission. So, Dr. Wilcox, thank you so much for being here today and joining us at the University of Central Florida campus. Our region, our community of industry, university partners are so excited to hear from you. Though she is on leave while she serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary, Dr. Wilcox is a Presidential Distinguished Professor of Chemical Engineering and Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. As a Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute, Dr. Wilcox led WRI's carbon removal program. She grew up in Maine, a wonderful place, and has a profound respect and appreciation for nature. Dr. Wilcox holds a PhD in chemical engineering and a master's in chemistry from the University of Arizona and a BA in mathematics from Wesley College. Please, let's extend to her a good welcome from Central Florida, the University of Central Florida.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Grace. This is great to be here with you all today. And I'm just going to go ahead and get started. And so what I wanted to start with is you've heard a lot of the legislation that's passed. And so I want to go through a little bit of a recent realignment that the Department of Energy has taken under associated with a lot of the funding that's come through. And so one of these is the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so the bipartisan infrastructure law provides about $62 billion worth of funding to develop infrastructure for clean energy technologies. And this funding is really going to be spent over the next 5 years to build out the infrastructure over the next 5 to 10 years. And so to give you a little bit of an understanding of the realignment of the Department of Energy, this is an org chart. So it's not meant to, you're not meant to see everything here, but the idea is that I wanted to share a little bit of our office, which is the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and the role that it plays in really seeing some of these dollars going out the door. And so when you look at this, our office is right here, Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and we report directly to an Undersecretary for Science and Innovation. So in this realignment of the Department of Energy, this new word was added, science and innovation. And so through our annual appropriations, taxpayer dollars, we are investing across a broad range of approaches in fossil energy and carbon management that are really looking at investing in technologies that minimize environmental and climate impacts of our dependence on fossil fuels. And so in the rest of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about that work specifically and the role of hydrogen. But the other important aspect is that through the infrastructure law funding, we have also developed a new Undersecretary Office for Infrastructure. So this is new. And so that infrastructure office also has a new office, which is the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And so when you hear about hydrogen hubs, when you hear about integrated CCS demonstrations, those dollars are actually going through this new Office for Infrastructure. And it's really focused on bringing in talent that actually knows how to handle large projects, where the day-to-day operations in the applied offices are more about R&D, middle technological readiness level, that we're pushing up the pipeline so that ultimately there's going to be a home for the infrastructure and then ultimately commercial deployment. The other thing that I want to mention too is the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act is also recent legislation that was passed. So the bipartisan infrastructure law was all about the dollars that are going into building the first of a kind, costly demonstrations, because they're too expensive for the private sector to build on their own today. And that's why we haven't seen that progress. And so first of a kind, costly demonstrations. Now, once we get those out the door and those demonstrations are complete, the costs will be transparent. And the transparency of those costs lead to the policy incentives for the private sector to then invest in the second and third and fourth of a kind. But the Inflation Reduction Act is the policy levers. So for instance, you might have heard the 45Q. So 45Q is a federal tax credit, and before the IRA was passed, it was about $50 per ton to capture CO2 and store it deep underground. And this is, a route that we can make for blue hydrogen today. If the hydrogen is sourced, for instance, from natural gas, and you capture the CO2 and you sequester it deep underground. But when you look at the costs of doing carbon capture, you recognize that $50 is not really the right price. Certainly not for first of a kind or even second or third for a lot of the sectors that we're trying to decarbonize. So the Inflation Reduction Act actually increases that 45Q to $85 per ton. And then also there's a whole nother tool that we have in the kit that we're investing in. And that's something called direct air capture. And you probably have heard of that, but it's very different from point source capture. So direct air capture is where we take CO2 out of the diluted CO2 in the atmosphere. Right? So it's very dilute once it gets into the atmosphere, at like say 410, 415 parts per million. But we recognize that we can't get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions without it. And that critical tool is essential for decarbonizing sectors that are hard to decarbonize today, like agriculture, aviation, shipping, long-haul trucking in some cases. And I bring that up because the Inflation Reduction Act also includes a bump up in 45Q to $180 per ton for that technology. And so the infrastructure law funding is building the first of a kind demonstrations. And the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is more the policy levers that are put in place so the private sector can now, in an economic way, have the incentives through 45Q, tax credits and things like this, to actually build the second and third and fourth of a kind. The final piece is the CHIPS and Science Act, and you might have heard of this. So through that CHIPS and Science Act, the Office of Science at DOE is receiving $50 billion. The important aspect there, though, is there's a difference between dollars being authorized and dollars being appropriated. So the bipartisan infrastructure law, those are appropriated dollars. We are getting them. When dollars are authorized, doesn't necessarily mean that we see them right away. And so it's great. There's going to be $50 billion authorized to the Office of Science to do more of this great work through the CHIPS and Science Act. But we still need the bills to be put in place. We still need the legislation to pass. And then for us to ultimately see those dollars through appropriations. And so those are the three big pieces of legislation that have recently passed. And I wanted to be able to share with you at a high level of how the Department of Energy in the last year has restructured in order to create a sustainable path for not only having a place for those dollars to go, but making sure that the dollars don't stop. And so by building these boxes, like in the infrastructure office, it allows Congress to then put more funding in these in the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the dollars that we have for hydrogen hubs, or the dollars that we have for integrated CCS hubs or direct air capture hubs. But I don't want you to sit back and be like, oh, there's only 4. Are we going to be one of those 4? You know, because the idea is we've built something so that there's not just going to be 4, there's going to be more that are going to be coming down the road. So big picture, the final thing I'll mention in here, which is a small box, hard to see, but is the Loan Programs Office. So the Loan Programs Office also has a lot of exciting opportunities for loans. One distinct feature about Loan Programs Office is they cannot fund the same thing that's funded somewhere else in DOE. It has to be a unique approach. And that makes sense, because when you look at the applied offices, it's really about mid-level to higher TRL, where Loan Programs Office is lower risk, maybe second of a kind, a little bit different from the first of a kind. And so it's really meant to be the enabling in that bridge to a fully privately funded project. But the LPO program is an amazing opportunity as well, which is kind of connected to all of this. Okay, so next I want to now get into the heart of the office that I work for, fossil energy and carbon management. And I came in at the start of the administration on day 1 as a political appointee on leave as an academic, a professor in chemical engineering from UPenn. And so I've learned a lot over this last year and a half now, going on 2 years. But one of the things that I was asked to do was to completely reorganize this office. So it was previously the Office of Fossil Energy. And the reason is because we have an administration, the Biden-Harris administration, that has a primary focus on climate. But at the same time, recognizing, and certainly with the invasion in Ukraine, recognizing it's not just about climate, it's also about energy security. And so a lot of what we're doing in fossil energy and carbon management is making sure that everybody has access to energy equity, but also making sure that that energy is affordable and that it's clean. And so everything that we're doing is about investing in decarbonizing and reducing pollution of fossil fuels so that they can actually be part of the solution. And so we did flip the mission upside down in FECM. We added the 2 critical words, carbon management, to our title, and that took place on July 4th last year. And then the reorganization was completed. Actually, I just looked at the calendar this morning. It'll be a year Monday. So September 12th last year, our reorganization was completed. The largest reorganization of our office since its inception in 1977. And everything that we're doing is really aligning with the targets and the climate goals of the administration, and they're outlined here. 50% emissions reduction by 2030. That's less than a decade away. CO2 emissions-free power by 2035, and then net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. And so when we look at the sectors that are responsible for our emissions today, and you can see them off to the right, what I wanted to do when we reorganized is to think about what does our portfolio in FECM look like today? How are we investing? In our annual appropriations now, we actually have, I'll just say it was pretty exciting when I first started, because, we went from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, very different goals in terms of climate. And my team, when I came on, the staff literally thought that the budget was going to be zeroed out in the new administration. But because we flipped the mission upside down and we realigned, in fact, what happened in that first year is our budget increased And in fact, this year we have the largest budget that the office has ever seen. And so it's really a testament to this vision and recognizing that it's not about leaving fossil fuels in the ground, it's about recognizing that everybody needs access and that we need to make sure that it's clean, reliable. And so that's really been the focus. And so if you want to know more about our strategic vision, you can simply download it from our website. And this is an image on the right-hand side. And that artistic, drawing that you see of the puzzle here, the idea there is, if you're not familiar, those are the climate stripes in the background. And climate stripes, what they are is recognizing the temperature at the start of the Industrial Revolution and correlating the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere to the temperature. And so, of course, before we started emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, the CO2 concentrations were lower, 270 ppm, and the global air temperature also lower than today on average. And so as we continue to increase that greenhouse gas effect and emit into the atmosphere, we're now at a stage where in the center of this, at a higher 410 to 415 parts per million CO2, depending on your location, and a much warmer temperature than before. The view is that if we're truly to achieve net zero by 2050, and the critical tool that I mentioned before, which is taking CO2 back out of the atmosphere, keep in mind that something like direct air capture or carbon dioxide removal, which is a broad portfolio, in the near term, we need those to offset or counterbalance hard to decarbonize sectors. But if we scale up today and start to get there by mid-century, say to a gigaton, then we'll actually, and we meet our deep decarbonization targets, we actually have an opportunity to take CO2 back out of the atmosphere in a way that maybe we can reverse those CO2 accumulated concentrations. So it's exactly what it should be. It's a dream, it's a vision, and that's the idea with that image. The other piece that's important here is recognizing that our office is really just one of many in that org chart that I showed you across Department of Energy, in that we all play a critical role, whether it's nuclear, whether it's energy efficiency, or renewable energies. And a lot of it will involve engagement. A lot of it will involve understanding justice considerations, whether it's energy equity, climate justice, restorative justice, where we start to build trust between communities and industry. So all of these pieces need to be part of the puzzle in order for us to scale up and be successful. So as we dug deep into that strategic vision exercise, which we released in April earlier this year, we also looked at, looking at our investments and asking ourselves, how are we dependent on fossil fuels today? How hard is this really going to be? And what does it mean, in terms of our investments in FECM and more broadly, Department of Energy? And so what this is really just looking at the three different fossil fuels: natural gas, oil, and coal. And this is all publicly available information, but just displayed in a way that tells a story that I think hadn't been told before. And so what you see in each of the top bars is energy consumption and net exports. And the reason it's important to include net exports is because we really want to understand that we all live in the same greenhouse. And so that means that if we're decarbonizing the United States, but we're increasing our export and exporting our emissions out, that's not really helpful. And so wanted to be able to understand how much are we exporting today, how might that increase in the future. And so energy consumption and net exports for each of these fossil fuels, and then the parallel greenhouse gas emissions. And then each of the colors correspond. In blue, you see heat, maybe commercial or residential, industrial heat, then also transportation is in green, electric power is in red, supply chain. So that means that when we produce fossil fuels out of the earth, it takes energy to do that. But also, there's often methane emissions associated with the production of oil and gas and even coal mines. And so that also needs to be included in the whole emissions profile. And then exports, I mentioned, but then there's this gray box with a question mark. And that gray box with a question mark is really important. What that is actually the unknown emissions associated with methane from oil, gas, and coal. And so we actually don't have a good transparent quantification of where all the methane is today. And so a big part of our office and why the budget increased so much over the last 2 years is because we've actually expanded our program of methane quantification and mitigation so that we can ensure that industry has the tools off the shelf to make sure that the supply chain is as leak tight as it can be. And so that question mark is a question mark because we're actively working with our colleagues at the Environmental Protection Agency to make sure that we can do everything we can to quantify and mitigate methane. And so that's just an active area for us. Now, when you look at each of these fossil fuels, you recognize how we depend on them. And I would say natural gas is the most complicated. When we look at natural gas, we depend on it for heating our homes. We depend on it for industrial heat. We depend on it for power generation. And so we have to think, what are all the tools that we have to decarbonize it? When we think about heating, it's very difficult. It's almost like transportation and passenger vehicles. It's very distributed. We all may have gas boilers at home, and you ask yourselves, do I want to replace it with a new gas boiler with a higher efficiency? But then you're locking that in, And so I think, I also look at this, and we can use this to ask ourselves, what role will hydrogen play? How can we use hydrogen to displace natural gas for heating? Heating in homes, or there's the opportunity to co-fire and use existing infrastructure today in homes. But the role that hydrogen plays in decarbonizing means, potentially having an opportunity to squeeze some of these wedges. But the other piece is that the tools that we're investing in, a lot of the tools do have to do with carbon capture. And when you look at power generation from natural gas, CCS is a pretty good option. And so through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have 2 demonstrations that will be funded by law for CCS power from natural gas. And if you notice too, the infrastructure in the United States today, we depend on gas for a lot of our power. And it's also very reliable in a lot of places. And we call these committed emissions because they're newer utilities that are going to last through mid-century. So decarbonizing them is going to be a lot easier than having to pull that CO2 back out of the atmosphere. When you look at the oil sector, for the oil sector, it's mostly the transportation sector is how we depend on oil today. In FECM, there's not a lot of work that we're doing associated with refining or in this sector, but one thing that we are focused on is synthetic fuels. And so looking at CO2 and hydrogen, clean hydrogen, as chemical feedstocks to producing synthetic fuels and chemicals, which can help us to relieve the dependence we have. And so that is one area that we're heavily focused on. And then finally, when you look at our dependence on coal, it's mostly associated with power generation today. And so also through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have 2 projects that will be funded with CCS on coal-fired power plants as well. So in our mission statement, I've mentioned this a little bit, but I also just want to say these are the 7 areas of focus that we have. We have 2 primary areas of R&D in fossil energy and carbon management. One is associated with how we produce fossil fuels today and minimizing environmental and climate impacts of that. And the second part is how do we use fossil fuels and how do we reduce the pollution there? And that's where we also have our hydrogen with carbon management program. So all of the things that we do in the hydrogen with carbon management division, we look at, for instance, how we make hydrogen from different feedstocks. Whether it's, from biomass or natural gas, just hydrocarbons as a feedstock. But then we also ask ourselves, what do we do with the hydrogen? And so is it for power generation, for instance? And so we have in our office also work on advanced turbines, which I know is exciting to meet some of you who have received funding from this division, which is exciting. And so that's another area. We're working also with our other partners across DOE, like ERE and nuclear, recognizing that technology, if it's 100% firing of hydrogen, shouldn't matter what color it is going in. And so we're trying to really leverage and do more cross-cutting work with advanced turbines, advanced materials for harsh environments. And then finally, an important piece is sensors. And so we often think about sensing as, being able to improve efficiency of a unit. like feedback loops. And we think of it as making sure that we have infrastructure that's safe as we think about hydrogen storage and transport. But another piece that's important too is recognizing that hydrogen is actually an indirect greenhouse gas. So when hydrogen is released into the atmosphere, it reacts with hydroxyl radicals. And those hydroxyl radicals actually typically are the ones that help us to react with methane, so that methane has a shorter lifetime. It reacts in that way. So if hydrogen now is reacting with OH in the atmosphere, it means OH isn't reacting with methane, and methane persists. And so this leakage potential of hydrogen, not just from a safety threshold, but from actually a warming threshold, we really have to be able to develop very sensitive measures so to make sure that the infrastructure we develop for hydrogen is leak tight and that we're monitoring that and we understand it. Otherwise, we might end up in an unintended consequence. So some of the work too, when we think about gasification, is also recognizing that gasifiers are a unique technology and that you can put a lot of things in there, mixed feeds, but recognizing too that there's a lot of work to do from an R&D perspective in terms of these units. The fact that there is mixed feeds, it could be waste plastic, it could be biomass, it could be natural gas. So a lot of the work that we're doing is really investing in advanced gasification processes. You've probably heard too, we have a series of earth shots that are all across DOE that are coming out. So the hydrogen earth shot was one of the first, and this is looking at, again, all colors, but getting the cost down to $1 per kilogram over the next decade across all the different aspects. Some of the gasification technologies and challenges that we're trying to address is thinking about the air separation aspect, which also has applications to, if you have a steam methane reforming unit and you want to retrofit that to feed oxygen so that you can get deeper decarbonization rather than just carbon capture on an SMR, there's going to be also integrated oxygen processes that you can use too. So air separation, chemical looping as another way to bring oxygen into a system. These are all approaches that we're excited in investing in today. Just briefly, you might have heard of funding opportunity announcement 2400. It's been kind of an open opportunity announcement that we continue to keep. But when I talked about the budget expansion before, our Office of Resource Sustainability, which again has to do with the production of fossil fuels, now has a new hydrogen program as well. And the reason for that is because when we look at the production of oil and gas, we notice that there are truly cases that are hard to avoid the methane emissions. It's really not cost effective to bring in the handling lines or the infrastructure for the methane, but we still need to deal with it. And so the concept of being able to develop mobile methane to hydrogen conversion processes or methane to ammonia conversion processes, like something that you can actually deploy in the field, is something now that we're excited about and investing in under the 2400 FOA. And the other piece about this is when we think about the agricultural sector and we think about other even natural methane emissions that take place in the earth, we could imagine these same approaches going into the field in those ways and harvesting that methane and converting it to something like hydrogen or ammonia that's more useful. Just some examples of some of the investments that we've made in low-cost oxygen and through different separation processes using adsorption. There's another pressure-driven oxygen separation, cryogenic, and even molecular sieves and hollow fiber membranes. Wanted to talk a little bit about this concept as well. So sourcing hydrogen from biomass. And so when we look at the opportunities of decarbonizing industrial sectors, so cement, steel, and we all know, direct reduction of iron with hydrogen, for instance, or even bringing in syngas so that the kinetics might be better in terms of direct reduction of iron. So we have these different industries that are hard to decarbonize and oftentimes require high quality heat. And the other piece is when you look at a cement kiln, it's not always firing one fuel. It will fire coal, it'll fire gas, maybe even diesel, waste tires. And so there's about 91 cement facilities across the United States as outlined here. They collectively emit roughly 67 million tons of CO2, at least back in when I had this data, I think it was 2020. And so just as an example with cement, there's drop-in fuels for coal, like for instance, biomass. Turns out like nutshells have a very similar carbon structure to subbituminous coal, and the same carbon density, same kind of pore structure, so that you get similar oxygen transport through the materials. And so being able to use these waste biomass feedstocks as a drop-in fuel for the solid fuel, and then being able to use hydrogen as potentially a drop-in fuel for the methane or for the natural gas, because it's only a fraction, maybe it's only 30% of the kiln fuel. And so there's creative strategies where we can use co-firing, but replacements with these drop-in fuels. And so just looking at the opportunities, also noting here a little interesting strategy, and this is work from when I was at UPenn, but the refineries. When you look at refineries today, you know, many are making hydrogen because they need it for hydrocarbon cracking, and they are making it from steam methane reforming. But you also notice that a lot of those refineries are producers of CO2. So the food and beverage industry is a pretty small consumer of carbon dioxide, but it exists. And where do they get their CO2 from today? Chemical production facilities, so also refineries. And so when you look on Google Earth, it turns out you can often see, and this is true in Richmond, California, next to the refinery is a Coca-Cola plant. You know, so oftentimes the CO2 is used, but the thing is they're capturing the CO2 from their steam methane reforming, but they're venting a lot of it to the atmosphere because there's no market for the CO2. So I say that's low-hanging fruit. You know, there are a lot of these opportunities where the chemical companies are making too much CO2 regionally. There's just not a market for it. Of course, you know, we didn't see that with COVID and the vaccines and eating dry ice, but we saw a shortage, actually. But you do see this opportunity. And so when we look at fuel switching, you know, you're looking at hydrogen, looking at waste biomass that may be available, you actually have regions in the United States where you can even go negative in terms of the carbon emissions associated with these hard to decarbonize sectors today. And so it's really, I think, creative to think about what role does hydrogen play and what role can it play with other drop-in fuels to help us to decarbonize these really tough industries. The last thing I'll say about this is that when you think about something like cement and certainly steel, you recognize that those facilities need low barriers to transition because they have a customer base. And the customer base is expecting a certain quality of the material. And that formulation is so important. And so you can't just necessarily overnight switch to an electric kiln or switch to something because that disrupts that industry. And so when you do things like this, it's pretty creative, allows them to keep their infrastructure and then also allows them to still maintain the quality of the product. And so one thing I want to mention too with hydrogen is the other carbon negative shot, which is the carbon removal. And again, a big area is looking at hydrogen, how it reacts with CO2 for synthetic fuels. Also wanted to mention too, this is the bipartisan infrastructure law. I've already talked about this a little bit, but 4 direct air capture hubs at $3.5 billion, looking at carbon storage and validation for $2.5 billion. What we're hoping to get, and I'm just going to point to this for a moment, for that funding, what we're looking at is building out the infrastructure for CO2 sequestration across the United States that scales to 60 to 100 million tons of CO2 injection per year. And so if you are thinking about a hub, if you are thinking about blue hydrogen and thinking about, well, what am I going to do in terms of managing the carbon dioxide, this is funding that's available to help build out the infrastructure so that you can make the blue hydrogen. And then mentioned also the hydrogen hubs through the infrastructure law funding $8 billion for at least 4 projects, including one with fossil fuels and carbon management. And then also wanted to just give an update a little bit, the diversity of the feedstock, also end use diversity, geographic diversity, and then finally This is just the current status and next steps. So we issued a request for information back in March, and then a notice of intent in June, and we should be sending out the funding opportunity announcement in the coming weeks, which is exciting. And so thanks again for having me here today, and looking forward to a Q&A if there's still time.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'll add, so we have questions that are coming in from from both audiences, and so we're going to do a little tag team on those questions. So I'll tee up the first one, and it has a lot to do with being here in Central Florida. We had a chance to talk just about the entertainment industry, the transportation and the ports, being known around space and aerospace, and just being central in defense. So we have a very interesting community, a very interesting region. So just maybe your perspective on, building these ecosystems, from how the department sees those things and partnering with industry and academia. And if you don't mind, because I think it would be good for us to hear a little bit about the energy equity and what does that really mean?
Absolutely. Okay, so the first question, thinking about a hubs concept, I think it's important to recognize that every region has a different pathway to achieving net zero, and every region has, their own challenges associated with land, low carbon energy, and water. But those are all of the considerations that you have to bring into the equation. And so some of what we've been working with the national labs a little bit on is leveraging what these pathways may look like for different regions of the United States. And because the labs are strategically placed across the US. And so part of that is well, if we have an administration goal of 50% emissions reduction in 10 years, less than 10 years, and 100% clean electricity by 2035, I think you have to ask that first question of where are you getting your electricity today in the region? And what are the opportunities or the options for decarbonizing the power? And then recognizing that time frame by which it needs to be done. And then being really clear about, okay, we've got these different pathways to decarbonizing, but what's left over? What emissions are really truly hard to decarbonize? How much agriculture is there? How much dependence on passenger vehicles? We saw California banned all new internal combustion engines, I think, for 2035 and on. But they have to recognize that they can't take people's cars away, and somebody might, so there's an invested infrastructure and committed emissions. Those need to be added up, and net zero means that those need to go to zero too, and counterbalance with carbon removal. So to me, it's like the hub concept is, you want to kind of dig once, right? And so what are all of those pieces of the puzzle, and whether it's through hydrogen or whether it's through CCS, and they all need to kind of come together. In terms of energy equity, I think that question is like, it's not just about do you have access to energy. There are parts of the United States that have to choose between, heating and eating, right? And so we need to make sure that everybody has access, especially here in Florida, the importance of air conditioning so that it's comfortable and safe for people. And some people can't afford that, right? And so we need to make sure that if we're doing CCS on power, for instance, that is not carried then to the ratepayers, right? And so being able to think about all of these things in this way is going to be critical.
That was excellent. Thank you. I think that was very helpful. Subith, I think do we have a question from online?
Yeah, there are a few questions from the chat. The first one is about how easy or difficult is it for small and medium industry to be part of this hydrogen funding opportunities that the DOE has? You could expand more on.
Sure. So small to medium, I wouldn't go small to medium. I'd ask about the TRL. So then where to go. So if it's a company that's kind of just getting off the ground and it's still doing like lab work, for instance, it could be somewhere that there's an opportunity between the Office of Science or working with a regional national lab through the technology commercialization fund program, or SBIR, or program small businesses. But if it's a mid-level TRL, like somewhere 3 to 5, then you'd want to go to the applied offices. If it has to do with fossil energy and carbon management, I kind of gave an overview of what we're funding in terms of hydrogen, but we are not the only place. So the energy efficiency and renewable energy group has a lot of funding associated. In fact, their budget's 3 times the size of ours. And so they have a lot of opportunities for middle to higher TRL for hydrogen work, and nuclear as well. They have a program called the Integrated Energy Systems Program. So when you look at nuclear as a feedstock for hydrogen production, there's also a question of what do you do with the hydrogen? And so there is we actually partnered with the nuclear office to put out a funding opportunity announcement, and we supported 5 FEED studies, which are front-end engineering design, higher TRL, before like pilot stage. And the idea there is to leverage nuclear with direct air capture, and if nuclear is doing hydrogen, then they could actually also think about synthetic fuels with CO2 and hydrogen. So there's some exciting opportunities, that are cross-cut in that space. But then finally, if it's high TRL and it's not necessarily first of a kind, but kind of close, there's the Loan Programs Office, and a lot of opportunities with the Loan Programs Office.
Do we have any questions from the audience? If you don't mind standing and saying who you're with and say your question, please. Here's a microphone.
Hello, I'm a postdoctoral scholar here in University of Central Florida with Dr. Kapat. I would like to know, you mentioned that we are aiming for $1 per kilogram of hydrogen. Where does that number stand today without tax or subsidy? Best achievable?
It depends on the feedstock.
Yes,
so pretty close if it's natural gas, like steam methane reforming, but when it comes to, say, electrolysis, pretty far. And so it really depends on but the idea there is the Earthshot that we've outlined is really looking at bringing all approaches to the table, and every proposal that's submitted has to have a techno-economic analysis. And so in the and a life cycle assessment, so you have to do careful, carbon accounting, not necessarily if it's, by the way, methane, it's at the facility. So the gate is at the facility when you do the intensity in terms of greenhouse gas. But ultimately, in the end, that dollar per kilogram also has guardrails associated with the greenhouse gas intensity of the hydrogen that's produced. So you have to be careful about making sure you account for the emissions of that holistic system. But with every proposal submitted, careful carbon accounting and the techno-economic analysis needs to be outlined as well.
So I think we have time maybe for one last question. Go ahead.
Talat Rahman, Professor of Physics. One unfair question. What do you see as opportunities for your division to be partnering with Basic Energy Sciences of DOE in solving some of these problems?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I'm actively doing that. I'm actively doing that because I come from, being an academic, and that's just how I think. And I didn't even know much about fossil energy and carbon management until I started. Most of my relationship was Basic Energy Sciences before. And basic energy research as well. And so what we're doing actually right now, and literally this morning in an email, so like now, is our program managers in FECM and also our technology managers, which work with our program managers, but they're at NETL, so we work in partnership to develop funding opportunity announcements, to review proposals and all of that. But what we don't want is to miss opportunities in the Office of Science. The mission in the Office of Science is not to be applied. It's about to discover. And what I don't want to do, I ask them, what's your efficiency? How do you know, if you didn't miss something because somebody wasn't there thinking, hey, I know an application for that, And we hear about the amazing things, but what about the ones that got through, right, that nobody caught? And so what we're doing is I've taken all the key areas like catalysis,
interfacial and molecular science, all the key areas in basic energy science, because their PI meetings are this fall. And I've connected my program managers, coupled to NETL tech managers, to attend the PI meetings. And they're just flies on the wall, and they're listening. And then what they hear, I would like to shape our FOAs at the higher TRL so that there's a pipeline. And then that means that if you're an applicant and you got a proposal through BES and you're wondering where to go next, and you read our opportunity announcement, you see yourself in it. That's what we want to do. And so that's an active area. It's taken a little bit of time, but thank you.
Some great questions. Thank you, audience, for the questions. I would like to just, if we could all give a warm thanks to Dr. Wilcox
you.
for joining us. And as we like to say, nice, Chair John. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Wilcox, and thank you, Dr. Bohannon.